Carl Jung's perspective, The Archetype of Orientation, from my book, The Search for Being. To actualize our being, we need confirmation from others. We need twinship or others of like temperament to act as role models, others we can identify with. We need a facilitating environment receptive to the expression of our talents and gifts. When none of these things are present, we can feel empty and confused. In those cases, psychological type can be an archetype of orientation. It helped its author, Carl Jung, orient his own being in his traumatic break with Sigmund Freud, thus preparing the way for the expression of his most creative ideas which followed. Rather than discuss the concept of psychological type in general, to get a more concrete idea of how it can elucidate being, the focus of this chapter will be on a person many readers know. He may have been one of the most misunderstood people in contemporary history. Because he belonged to one of the rarest of psychological types, the probability is that he didn't find twinship. That might account for the fact he didn't seem to be comfortable in his own skin. His biographers, David Maraniss and Ellen Nakashima, describe the young Al Gore as a person who seemed to grow up without a best friend or belong to any groups. They paint the picture of a young man who liked books and would lend them to friends. As a journalist, they tell us Al Gore worked well alone and seemed to enjoy spending hours in a library or document room or in a state or county offices researching articles. As a senator, he had a reputation for understanding things in depth, a man willing to spend hours talking with experts. And we've all seen presidential candidate Al Gore come across as stiff and distant before a crowd, and yet heard reports that in talking to someone one-to-one, he can be very intense. All this points to Al Gore as being an introvert. Carl Jung explains there are two attitudes that can describe the direction of a person's interests: extraversion or introversion. Which attitude we develop is determined to a large degree by our own natures. A young child as early as 1 or 1.5 begins to show signs of extraversion or introversion. An extrovert's interests and attention are focused on people or things. They have many friends, they're energized by being around people and engaging in activities in the outer world. Their decisions and actions are determined by objective conditions. An introvert is more energized by what Carl Jung calls the archetypes, the inner subjective world of ideas and concepts. They tend to be reflective, needing time to ponder things before they can tell you how they feel about them. Where the extrovert prefers breadth, the introvert prefers depth. They're often absorbed in thought, prefer quiet and one-to-one relationships to crowds. We all function best in our preferred world. Al Gore, the politician, is an introvert, living in an extroverted world. He has strayed a long way from his dream, described by his biographers, of buying the Carthage Courier with his wife and living in a cabin by a lake in Tennessee, where they would both write books. With an extrovert, what you see is what you get. Their dominant function is extroverted. But with an introvert, their dominant function, their best, is hidden. Only those who are truly close to them get to see that side of them, really know them. His biographers tell how Gus Stanisek, who was in the army with Gore, said Gore reminded him of a character in a book he had read who could see into the future. Friends and foes alike admit Gore played a role in the development of the internet, coining the term superhighway. At Harvard, Gore did his thesis in the Department of Government, we learn in his biography, on the impact of television on the conduct of the presidency, 1047 to 1969. He seemed to have foresaw that the effectiveness of future presidents would depend in no small part on their television skills. From all this, I conclude Gore's dominant function may be introverted intuition. He seems to be good at foreseeing new possibilities, new ways of doing things. He was speaking about environmental issues, the effect of global warming, before many others. Introverted intuitives often seem able to see into the future, to predict trends and events in advance of everyone else. His ideas about the automobile seem to illustrate this. Introverted intuitives have an uncanny ability to discern the possibilities in a situation. They tend to be writers or artists or counselors or to go into religiously oriented occupations. In reading his biography, one sees how Gore's interests were the interests of an intuitive. English was his favorite subject. He liked sacred studies. He studied art for 9 years. In his early days at Harvard, he thought of himself as an artist, telling a friend he wanted to be an author. Intuitives are often funny because they see relationships in things that we often don't think of as going together, and Gore could be funny. As a newspaper man, others noted, it says in his biography, that he was very good at interviewing, which also is indicative of a dominant perceptive function like intuition. He enjoyed philosophical discussions. Intuitives prefer the abstract to the concrete. Some have called introverted intuitives the most useless of men because they enjoy learning for learning's sake and often don't do anything with it. Gore took courses in religious studies for his personal reasons, we learn in his biography. He had seen others come back from Vietnam disoriented by the war, and he didn't want that to happen to him. So after Vietnam, his biographers say, he took courses in ethics and morality to ponder what was right and what was wrong. Carl Jung tells us intuition is one of the 4 functions of consciousness. Feeling, thinking, and sensation are the others. When we prefer one function over the others, and all of us are with good type development do, we call that our superior or dominant function. It's our dominant function that determines our type. Those who have sensing as a dominant function focus their attention on the surface of things, what they see, hear, feel, smell, touch. They trust facts, are practical, literal, realistic, like to go about things in a linear step-by-step manner. They notice details. Those who have intuition as a dominant function focus their attention on their intuitions, insights, or hunches. They're more focused on the future than the present, what changes can be made, what possibilities there are. Intuitions just come. They don't proceed step by step. The style of intuitives is more discursive, often jumping from one thing to another in conversation. They search for the underlying meaning, how things are related. They become bored in highly structured situations. They are the dreamers. Imagination is important to them. When thinking is the dominant function, decisions are made in an impersonal way. Dominant thinkers trust logic and strive to be objective. They decide things by weighing the pros and cons and looking at the consequences. Truth is what's considered important. Feeling can also be used to make decisions. When feeling is the dominant function, decisions are made more with the heart than the head. Instead of truth, human values and harmony are what is most important. Feeling types are compassionate and sympathetic. In making decisions, they look at what they like and what other people like. Where thinking types excel at creating logical order in their external environment, people whose dominant function is feeling excel at handling human relations. Al Gore's dominant function is easily discerned by seeing the mistakes he keeps on making. In order for the intuitive to get those hunches and insights to see below the surface of things, consciousness has to be unfocused and diminished. It can't be focused on the surface, what one sees, feels, hears, smells, tastes. So for the intuitive, especially the introverted intuitive, So the intuitive, especially the introverted intuitive, is often the picture of the absent-minded professor, looking for the glasses that are on his head. If you are a dominant sensing type, most of what you see and hear will attain the threshold value and be perceived. If you are an introverted intuitive, what you see and hear may not attain the threshold value necessary for perception. So during a stump speech, Al Gore pulled a piece of paper out of his back pocket with the names on it of the people he wants to thank. When he deviates from the slip of paper and spontaneously thanks Roger Hornsby, his wife steps up and he corrects him and says Bruce Hornsby. He's especially vulnerable to an eruption of his inferior function, which according to type theory would be extraverted sensing for dominant introverted intuitives, when he extroverts too much. Too many interviews, days when there is no time for the quiet and reflection an introvert needs to recharge his batteries, can make Al Gore more apt to make factual mistakes. The theory says it will always be his inferior function, extroverted sensing, that will throw him, especially when he is under stress. Sensation is an obstacle to intuition. You can't attend to sensory stimuli at the same time your attention is focused subjectively. Marie-Louise von Franz writes in the book Lectures on Jung's Typology, the introverted intuitive is often so completely unaware of outer facts that his reports have to be treated with the greatest care. Though he does not lie consciously, he can tell the most appalling untruths simply because he does not notice what is under his nose. This comes from his weakness in observing facts and their lack of concentration on external sensation. So Al Gore gets his facts wrong when he tells the story about his dog's arthritis medication, when he goes to the Buddhist temple and gets excited about visiting a sacred temple and what it means. Gore said he went with James Lee Witt during the Texas wildfires. He went, but not with Witt. We remember things we focus our attention on. Inferior sensing is not good with details. Introverted intuitives frequently make errors of fact. And it is worse when they are under stress, worse in a debate where the stakes are high, worse in an interview where the introvert hasn't had sufficient time to reflect on the question. Introverts only know what they really think on a topic after reflecting on it. Our inferior function is the most undeveloped part of ourselves. For the introverted intuitive, whose inferior is extraverted sensing, his greatest problem is remembering facts. Type theory tells us our inferior function is less under conscious control than our dominant function. Willpower is no use in improving it. It tends to be very slow. For an introverted intuitive, doing something that requires extraverted sensing will often require more time than it would take for someone whose dominant function was sensing. In his biography, we get an idea of Gore's inferior sensing in his friend's tales of how Gore was constantly running into hog feeders and running off the road, one of the hazards of having a dominant function focused on the inner world rather than hog feeders in the external environment. Our dominant function works in the world that is most important to us, that we are most interested in, the inner world for introverts, the outer world for extroverts. For introverts, what their outer world sees is their second best function, their auxiliary. Since Al Gore is an introvert, what the outer world sees is his auxiliary process. According to type theory, our dominant function is balanced in two ways by our auxiliary process. When our dominant function is a perceptive process, either sensation or intuition, which we use to get information, our auxiliary, or our second best process, will be a judging one, either thinking or feeling, which we use to make decisions. The auxiliary also balances our extraversion or introversion by operating in the other world. If our dominant process is introverted, for instance, then our auxiliary is extroverted. If we agree Al Gore's preferred way of getting information is intuition, a perceptive process, then his auxiliary will be a judging process, either thinking or extroverted feeling. and it is his exhilarate that the outer world sees. An extroverted feeling type is an expert in human relations. He will talk one way to one person and another way to a different person, sensitive to the nuances of their behavior and needs. The most important thing to an extroverted feeler is maintaining relationships that are harmonious with other people. They express themselves easily to others, exuding warmth, empathy, understanding. Al Gore doesn't seem to make decisions on the basis of extroverted feeling. As a senator, he seemed able to ignore the viewpoint of others, to be independent, crossing over party lines to vote with the opposition, even on heated issues like the Gulf War. He seems to make decisions on the basis of thinking rather than feeling. During the Vietnam War, we read in his biography, even though he was personally against the war, he made the decision to enlist in the army, and not very methodically, as though solving a problem in logic by weighing all the variables. For someone with thinking as a judging process, the criterion for decisions is what is right, what is wrong, not how do I feel about it. His biographers in The Prince of Tennessee tell us, Gore told a friend, enlisting was the right thing to do. It was your duty to your country. Extroverted thinking is adaptive and collective, says Jungian analyst. Gore never challenged the system. Since his boyhood days, we learn in his biography, he was the ultimate rule follower. He always tried to do the right thing by collective standards, whether the standards of his parents or his country. While in the service, his biographers point out, he excelled at conforming to collective expectations, winning the Soldier of the Month award, winning another award for the best-looking uniform and the shiniest boots. It would be an extroverted thinking type who would say, there is no controlling legal authority, always giving priority to objective criteria. Where it comes naturally to a feeling type to do little things that put others at ease, thinking types don't always consider the impact of what they do on others. Each type has its strengths and weaknesses. The strength of people who prefer thinking often lie in analytical thinking, problem solving, and their skill at planning. Extroverted thinking works toward the practical application of ideas. It focuses on objective data in a situation. Rather than depending on subjective ideas, it depends on external facts and generally accepted ideas according to type theory. An objective orientation rather than a subjective orientation predominates. It's good at solving practical problems, good at classifying facts, at planning programs, developing formulas. Isabel Myers writes in her book, Gifts Differing. Someone with a very developed thinking function would have a less well-developed feeling function. Feeling, as used in type theory, doesn't refer to affect, but rather evaluation. Feeling and thinking, type theory explains, oppose each other. We can't make decisions with both our heart and our head. Good type development means one predominates over the other. Someone with a less developed feeling function might wear a social mask, acting out the expectations of the community. It isn't that he's trying to put one over on the other people. It's that he doesn't have access to the highly discriminative feeling function that a dominant feeling type does. It might take an extroverted thinker more time before he can tell you how he feels, before he knows how he feels. James Hillman, in his book Lectures on Jung's Typology, which he authored with Marie-Louise von Franz, tells us a person whose feeling is more developed evaluates things with a variety of shadings. A more undeveloped feeling might lack that gradient of shadings and evaluate things more in terms of acceptance and rejection, good or bad. Republicans bristled when Al Gore used the term evil, seeming to see his fight as the fight between good and evil. Isabel Myers, who devised the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator with her mother Catherine Briggs, expanded Jung's type theory on psychological type to include the judging perceiving axis. This axis pertains to how we relate to the outer world. If Al Gore is an introvert who uses intuition in his inner world and thinking in the outer world, then because he is using a judging function, the thinking function, in the outer world, he would be considered a judger. Judging types like life planned, controlled, and scheduled. They're decisive and usually work first, play later.